Hi, everybody. This is Cale Clark. Welcome back to The Faith Explained on Relevant Radio and the Relevant Radio mobile app. Boy, do we have an exciting chapter for you today. It is Daniel chapter 8. I can't wait to get into it. It's incredible. More fantastic beasts, more wild visions, and a lot of encouragement for us today. So let's hop into the biblical text, and you can find it starting with verse 1. Daniel chapter 8. In the 3rd year of King Belshazzar's reign, I, Daniel, had a vision, after the one that had already appeared to me. In my vision I saw myself in the citadel of Susa, in the province of Elam. In the vision I was beside the Ulai Canal. I looked up, and there before me was a ram with 2 horns, standing beside the canal, and the horns were long. One of the horns was longer than the other, but grew up later. I watched the ram as he charged toward the west and the north and the south. No animal could stand against him, and none could rescue from his power. He did as he pleased and became great. As I was thinking about this, suddenly a goat with a prominent horn between his eyes came from the west, crossing the whole earth without touching the ground. He came toward the 2-horned ram I had seen standing beside the canal and charged at him in great rage. I saw him attack the ram furiously, striking the ram and shattering his 2 horns. The ram was powerless to stand against him. The goat knocked him to the ground and trampled on him, and none could rescue the ram from his power. The goat became very great, but at the height of his power his large horn was broken off, and in its place 4 prominent horns grew up toward the 4 winds of heaven. Out of one of them came another horn, which started small, but grew in power to the south and to the east and toward the beautiful land. It grew until it reached the host of the heavens, and it threw some of the starry host down to the earth and trampled on them. It set itself up to be as great as the prince of the host. It took away the daily sacrifice from him, and the place of his sanctuary was brought low. Because of rebellion, the host of the saints and the daily sacrifice were given over to it. It prospered in everything it did, and truth was thrown to the ground. Then I heard a holy one speaking, and another holy one said to him, "How long will it take for the vision to be fulfilled? The vision concerning the daily sacrifice, the rebellion that causes desolation, and the surrender of the sanctuary and of the host that will be trampled underfoot." He said to me, "It will take 2,300 evenings and mornings. Then the sanctuary will be reconsecrated." While I, Daniel, was watching the vision and trying to understand it, there before me stood one who looked like a man. And I heard a man's voice from the Ulai calling, "Gabriel, tell this man the meaning of the vision." As he came near the place where I was standing, I was terrified and fell prostrate. "Son of man," he said to me, "understand that the vision concerns the time of the end." While he was speaking to me, I was in a deep sleep, with my face to the ground. Then he touched me and raised me to my feet. He said, "I am going to tell you what will happen later in the time of wrath, because the vision concerns the appointed time of the end. The 2-horned ram that you saw represents the kings of Media and Persia. The shaggy goat is the king of Greece, and the large horn between his eyes is the first king. The 4 horns that replace the one that was broken off represent 4 kingdoms that will emerge from his nation, but will not have the same power. In the latter part of their reign, when rebels have become completely wicked, a stern-faced king, a master of intrigue, will arise. He will become very strong, but not by his own power. He will cause astounding devastation and will succeed in whatever he does. He will destroy the mighty men and the holy people. He will cause deceit to prosper, and he will consider himself superior. When they feel secure, he will destroy many and take his stand against the Prince of Princes. Yet he will be destroyed, but not by human power. The vision of the evenings and mornings that has been given you is true, but seal up the vision, for it concerns the distant future. I, Daniel, was exhausted and lay ill for several days. Then I got up and went about the king's business. I was appalled by the vision. It was beyond understanding. Okay, so that's Daniel chapter 8. I'm Cale Clark. You're listening to The Faith Explained on Relevant Radio and the Relevant Radio app. Okay, so Daniel 8, we've got some similarities to what we saw in the last chapter in Daniel chapter 7. This takes place, this vision that Daniel has, takes place at about the same time as chapter 7. King Belshazzar is still on the throne, so we're kind of going back to the time around Daniel chapter 5. Remember the writing on the wall, that king who was doomed. So we're looking at maybe 548 BC, 547 BC, about the third year of Belshazzar's reign. And just like in the last chapter, we've got a vision with more animals, more beasts. Two in particular, though. There's a battering ram and a shaggy goat. And you have no idea how badly I wanted to title this episode Not Ram Tough, right? Remember those Ram truck commercials with Sam Elliott's voice? Ram trucks, they're so tough. Well, this ram is certainly not tough. It gets absolutely shellacked. It gets beaten by the shaggy goat. We'll talk more about that in just a minute, what this represents. But the horns are coming out of their heads. This is way more straightforward than the beasts that we saw in the last vision that Daniel had in chapter 7. Remember those frightening hybrid beasts that came out of the sea? Well, these are much more straightforward. They're just straight up animals. And there's really no disagreement. It's also pretty straightforward in terms of the interpretation of what this is all about. In fact, the archangel Gabriel gives some of the interpretation to Daniel at the end. But biblical scholars, biblical commentators, they are all pretty much in agreement about who the ram represents and who the goat represents. It's all pretty clear. So the great theme here in this chapter is the same as all the rest of the book of Daniel. Despite the way things look from human eyes, from human appearances, God is still in control. God wins in the end, and he wins for his people. And again, this is apocalyptic literature now, the second half of the book of Daniel. And we talked about some of the symbols that are involved in apocalyptic literature. And in this chapter, we're going to see the importance of numbers. What do they stand for? Some of these prophetic numbers. We heard this number, 2,300 nights and mornings. And by the way, just a little sidebar here for all the little note for all the real Bible geeks out there. This chapter in the original text is written in Hebrew, Daniel chapter 8. Up until now, chapters 2 through 7 were all written in Aramaic, and people disagree about why that is. Nobody really knows for sure, but we're back to Hebrew in the original text. So what's happening here is in the third year of Belshazzar's reign, Daniel is transported in his vision to the banks of the Ulai Canal, which is in Susa. And that's, by the way, it's a modern-day Iraq. So this is really, really far from Daniel's home base. And so Tremper Longman suggests that really he gets transported in his vision to this place because that's the location, that's where these future powerful kingdoms, especially the kingdom of the goat, that's where it's coming from. So Daniel sees two animals in his vision, this ram with two horns, and it goes in three different directions. It goes west, it goes north, it goes south, and so it represents one particular kingdom. And then there's a goat, and the goat comes from the west, and it's got one gigantic horn on its head, and it is super fast. This is Usain Bolt type fast, okay, folks? It's running so fast, it's not even touching the ground. And in my own dreams, I run that fast, that I'm not even touching the ground. So this is hyper speed. And the goat completely annihilates the ram in battle. But despite the fact that it's so fast and it dominates the ram, it doesn't stay on top for very long. It doesn't stay on top of the mountain because at the height of its power, the large horn of the shaggy goat is broken off. Okay, so I think right now it's probably best to explain who these animals represent. Well, the ram, and some of you guys might have figured this out because it's very close to what we've seen in the previous chapters with the statue representing these kingdoms throughout history, the statue that King Nebuchadnezzar dreams about in chapter 2. We looked at the four beasts coming out of the sea in Daniel chapter 7. So the ram represents the kingdom of the Medes and the Persians, the Medo-Persian kingdom. And it has two horns because the Persians kind of subsume the kingdom of the Medes, kind of gobbles them up, and it kind of becomes a hybrid kingdom, the Medo-Persian kingdom. That's why there's two horns, representing the Medes and the Persians. And then the goat represents the Greek kingdom led by the Wunderkind, Alexander the Great. And Alexander, at such a precocious age, by the age of 26, he had conquered the known world with incredible speed. And that's why the goat is running so fast, it doesn't even touch the ground. You know, when I was a kid, I loved to read about history. And I remember learning about Alexander the Great really in detail, and of all places, an Iron Maiden heavy metal song. They did all these historical songs. They did a song about the poem, The Rime of the Ancient Mariner. And they did a song about Alexander the Great. And it was actually pretty cool because we learn very well the lyrics of songs, and I learned a lot about Alexander's career through this song. Bruce Dickinson, that great vocalist from Iron Maiden. Alexander the Great, his name struck fear into hearts of men. Okay, I'll stop there. I know you might want me to keep going, but who am I kidding? You probably want me to stop. Dogs are howling somewhere, but the song contained a lot of facts about his career, and it was amazing what he achieved in his early life. Just dominated, expanded his kingdom all the way from Italy to India in record time. But of course, he died at the very, very early age as well of 33 in the year 323 BC. Now, he had two sons that were to inherit the kingdom, one of whom I refer to as AJ, that was Alexander Jr., and the other one is Heracles. Now, Heracles was considered to be kind of maybe a pretender, a bit of a hoax. Was he really his son? There's a lot of question about that. But unfortunately, these two youngsters were assassinated. And Alexander's kingdom, which again was basically the entire world at that point, was divided between his four powerful generals, which were known as the Diadochi. And they're really those four horns. When that big horn is broken off of the goat, that's basically the death of Alexander. He was the powerful horn that just could conquer anything in his path. So that horn is broken off when it's at the height of its power, and then there's four prominent horns that spring up in its place in Daniel's vision, and those are the four generals of Alexander. Okay, so we're going to skip ahead a little bit in the history of the world. Let's look at one of those four horns. Okay, everybody agrees, pretty much all the commentators agree, that horn that grows out of, there's a little horn that grows out of one of the four, becomes larger and larger. That represents a king that comes out of one of the four little kingdoms that are split up from Alexander's territory. And almost everybody says that this is Antiochus IV Epiphanes. And we've talked about him a lot. He is the Seleucid ruler of the Seleucid kingdom, which is one of the kingdoms that eventually came out of Alexander's kingdoms. Antiochus IV Epiphanes. Now, epiphany means divine manifestation. So clearly this guy had delusions of grandeur. He basically tries to fight against God himself and wants to replace God, in a sense. And the text really tells us about this in Daniel chapter 8. It talks about, he will take his stand against the prince of princes. We see this in verse 25. So it's talking about Antiochus IV Epiphanes. This is around the time of the Maccabean revolt. He tries to oppress the people of God. We'll get into that in just a second. And he is defeated ultimately. So Antiochus is who the text is talking about. in verse 8 and following. It says, "The goat became very great, but at the height of his power, his large horn was broken off." Talked about that. That's the death of Alexander. And in its place, 4 prominent horns grew up towards the 4 winds of heaven. Out of one of them, and this is splitting up of the 4 kingdoms, out of one of them came another horn, which started small but grew in power to the south and to the east and toward the beautiful land. Now, where do you think the beautiful land is? That's the land of Israel, a land flowing with milk and honey, the promised land. It grew until it reached the host of the heavens, and it threw some of the starry host down to the earth and trampled on them. It set itself up to be as great as the prince of the host, and that's really God himself. It took away the daily sacrifice from him, and the place of his sanctuary was brought low. Anyways, okay, so let's just explain this a little bit. So Antiochus Epiphanes, again, we talked about the Maccabees before, the books of the Maccabees. He really started out, just like that horn, very, very tiny, didn't have much influence, but he became more powerful and more powerful as time went on. He actually was not supposed to get the throne. His older brother, Seleucus, was supposed to get the throne, Seleucus IV, but this guy, as the text says in verse 23 of Daniel 8, he is a master of intrigue. And that's exactly what Antiochus Epiphanes was like. He manipulated politically the process, was able to push his nephew out of the way, gain the throne, and he had a number of military successes early on, pushed into Egypt, as well as into Persia, Parthia, Armenia, and eventually, of course, the Holy Land of Palestine. But he was obviously very wicked, very wicked. Verse 23 says, completely wicked and stern-faced. And that's exactly what he was like. Now, when the text talks about taking away the sacrifice from God, taking away the sacrifice, so what's that really a reference to? Well, again, this is what happened in 167 BC. Now, at this point, Antiochus had been defeated by the Romans, and he was really ticked off by his humiliation there. So he comes back to the land of Israel, the Holy Land, and he says the temple sacrifices must stop. He orders them to be ceased, and then he commits what's known as the abomination that causes desolation. This is what is talked about in the New Testament. It's talked about here, the rebellion that causes desolation, this horrible, horrible act that he perpetrated. He profaned the temple in Jerusalem. He ordered the worship of the god Zeus, and Tremper Longman thinks that what he did there was bring in a meteorite. Well, so what, a meteorite? And this meteorite was associated with the pagan god Zeus. Maybe they thought Zeus hurled it down from the heavens. I don't know. But he brought it into the temple, and then he had a pig, which was the most unclean animal to the Jews, sacrificed on the altar to Zeus. This is what was known as the abomination that causes desolation. So this is really him setting himself against the God of heaven. But Daniel tells us in Daniel chapter 8, verse 25, yet he will be destroyed, but not by human power. And that's a reference to the fact that Judas Maccabeus and his brothers who led this revolt against the wicked King Antiochus and his armies, they were completely outmanned and outgunned, but by God's power they were able to defeat these evil rulers, rededicate the temple. That's what the Feast of Hanukkah is all about, the festival of light, and set things right once again. So this is prophesied in Daniel about the events that were going to come much later in the 2nd century BC. You're listening to The Faith Explained on Relevant Radio. I'm your host, Cale Clark. And now we come to this very strange number. This is an apocalyptic number that a lot of people have speculated on. And in apocalyptic literature, we do have these strange numbers. So here it's 2,300 days, or 2,300 morning and evening sacrifices. And people try all kinds of ways to fit this number into the revolt of the Maccabees in the 2nd century. So does this 2,300 days and nights, does this begin in 167 BC when Antiochus stops sacrifices to the one true God in the temple? Or when he starts burning the books of the Bible, burning the Torah, the books of Moses? starts instituting all his wicked regime policies. And maybe it's even earlier when the rightful high priest was removed in the year 171 BC. When does this period end? When the high priesthood comes back in the year 164, or maybe the next year when Antiochus himself dies? We don't really know. We can't press these numbers too finely, because really this time period, this definite time period, this number 2300 days and mornings, nights and mornings, it's meant to convey two things. Number one, that God is in control. Even though his people are suffering, there is a definite limit on this time of suffering. It won't last forever. God's aware of it. He hasn't fallen asleep at the switch. It's like the time of the Exodus when his people were enslaved in Egypt for 400 years. Was God not aware of this? Yes, he was, and he will act to free them. The same is true in the case of the Maccabean revolt. God helped his people, and they eventually had the victory. The bottom line is that persecution doesn't last forever. So this should be very, very encouraging to the people of God throughout the centuries. So all of this sort of good news is what's communicated by Gabriel to Daniel. He explains the vision. But that doesn't necessarily make Daniel feel much better. In fact, Daniel, it says at the end of the chapter, he says, I was exhausted and I lay ill for several days. I mean, this really impacted him. This was spiritually and physically stressful for him to hear that this is going to happen. But it also says this, then I got up and went about the king's business. In other words, Daniel got back to work. You're listening to The Faith Explained on Relevant Radio. I'm your host, Cale Clark. And so this is something I really want to expand upon a little bit in these last few moments here. This is how we can apply this to our lives today. Now, we know that Daniel has been given assurance that eventually his people are going to make it out of the exile in Babylon. They're going to make it back to the Promised Land. But just because they make it back to the Promised Land, of course this happens during the days of Nehemiah and Ezra, Cyrus, eventually as he gets control of things, the Medo-Persian Empire, Cyrus allows the Jews to go back to Israel, go back to Jerusalem, rebuild the temple. But they do eventually make it back, but that doesn't mean everything's hunky-dory. Their troubles are not over. In many ways, they're just beginning because of what was going to come later with the evil Antiochus Epiphanes, who thought he was a manifestation of God, fights against God's people. The bloody Maccabean revolt ensues. And so this is something really important for us to understand as well in our own lives. We can't fall prey to what St. Josemaria Escrivá called mystical wishful thinking. Now, when he was talking about this, he was mainly talking about it with respect to the past. People lamenting past events that they can't change. Oh, I wish I had done this, if only I hadn't done that. Maybe I should have gotten married, maybe I shouldn't have gotten married. Maybe I should have done this, maybe I should have taken this job or not taken that job or not made that wrong turn. It doesn't matter. You can't change that. You have to leave the past to God's mercy and trust that that's part of how he's working in your life. But people also can engage in mystical wishful thinking when it comes to future events too. And here's what I mean by that. People can think, well, you know what? I'm going to get things together once things aren't so busy at work. I'm going to sort of bookmark my spiritual life until things get better. And once I'm not so busy, then I'll start catechizing my children. You know, if you're a married person with a family or something like that. Or you might be tempted to think life will be better once you get to a future situation and you'll have no worries whatsoever. If you're single, you might think, well, my life will change when I get married, and then I'll have a problem pre-existence. That's not going to happen. Or whatever the case may be. If you're married and you don't have any children, something that personally happened to me for many, many years, you think, well, if you can only have a child, then things will be perfect. Well, no, because then there are more challenges, and there's some great things too. Obviously, it's a great gift. But the point of it is that whatever we're going through on this earth, there always is going to be struggles. There are always thorns on that rose, all right? And so we have to trust God in the midst of things and not wait to get started on our spiritual lives, the things that are really important. Daniel has this vision, and it doesn't even concern his own life. This is all going to happen long after he's passed into eternity. But it still bothers him, the fate of the people of God. And it should be something that we're concerned about as well. We should be concerned about our brothers and sisters who are suffering throughout the world. St. Paul was very much like this. He inwardly burned, he said, when other people were suffering temptation, it just really bothered him. He had a real pastoral heart when people fell into sin. He said, I wish I myself were cut off from heaven if I could only save my fellow Israelites. I wish they could take my place in the kingdom of God. So selfless in his thinking. But Daniel got back to work. He got back to work. He went about his daily tasks, and that's what we have to do as well. We have to find God in the middle of life right now. We have to find God in front of us right now, in whatever we might be going through, not thinking some mystical future time. That's when you'll find God. No. Right now. And I think that's one of the things that we get from Daniel's attitude at the end of this chapter. You've been listening to The Faith Explained on Relevant Radio. I'm your host, Cale Clark. Thanks for joining me today. And I can't wait to share the next episode of this Daniel series with you tomorrow. You can get caught up. If you've missed an episode, on relevantradio.com, you can look at the archives on the Faith Explained page, and also on the Relevant Radio app, wherever you get your podcasts. Please spread the good news far and wide, and let's get a revival of Catholic teaching, understanding the Scriptures through a Catholic lens. Hope you'll join me next time. Until then, God bless you.